I was really concerned, then going towards outraged, and therefore I'm in this fight now because I want people to know this is not how you legislate, and you don't legislate like this on something that's going to change the very nature of our society and how we, for all of us, deal with the end of our lives.
Hey Chelsea, why are we making a podcast about death?
Hi Fiona, good question. Two ladies talking about death. It's because we're worried women are not talking about these issues enough.
That's right, UK Parliament's debating laws on assisted dying, the results of campaigning all over the world for governments to take the pretty momentous step and offer death to their citizens. We really want you to join us as we learn why this is a huge issue for women.
We are so excited to be here today with Nikki Da Costa, who is former Director of Legislative Affairs in No. 10 Downing Street, and I have to say, personally, my favorite Twitter or X commentator on the assisted dying bill, a wealth of knowledge on this topic. Nikki, thank you so much for being here with us today, and we're really excited to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited. I was going to ask a question for those of us who are still a bit baffled by Parliament and what happens day to day. Could you explain what Director of Legislative Affairs does at a very simple level? And I suppose that might tell people why you've got such great insights, what might be happening in Parliament right now.
Absolutely, and beyond being a mouthful of a title, which I get all the time, what on earth were you there to do? So I worked for Theresa May and then Boris Johnson, and I was asked to come to No. 10 Downing Street specifically to establish the legislative affairs function for the Prime Minister. And the reason for that was that when a Prime Minister, particularly when you have no majority, needs to get something done in Parliament, you need to work out how you're going to do it, and how do you do it in a way that means that the Prime Minister knowingly takes a decision to walk into what might be a bit of a bun fight, or how do you do it in a way which avoids the bun fight? So my job was to try and what we call getting upstream on problems, to get into how do you develop the policy, to look at all the things that happen before a bill enters Parliament, which is the bigger part of bill development. And then once the bill was in, to just sort of be that watchful eye on those more tricky bills as they progressed and come up with solutions when MPs were raising issues and saying, well, actually, that's an issue. And I would push Whitehall and say, that's something valid that MP is raising. Where is the solution? Tell me more. So I was there to kick the tires, there to be the voice in the room saying, have you thought about? And really trying to bring Parliament into the room, because so often it's sort of seen as an afterthought sometimes by those in Whitehall. And I guess I don't think any of us expected to spend so many hours commenting on this bill. I got involved because the private members bill process, which is our least effective scrutiny process in Parliament. Westminster isn't great anyway, particularly the House of Commons at scrutinising bills, but the private members bill process is particularly not geared to that. In government, we say, it should be a small, worthy bill, not controversial, and I was really concerned, then going towards outraged, and therefore I'm in this fight now because I want people to know this is not how you legislate, and you don't legislate like this on something that's going to change the very nature of our society and how we, for all of us, deal with the end of our lives.
I've been so grateful for what you've been saying, because it's that this is so big, it's such a huge magnitude of a change to make, and scrutiny is the one thing that seems not to be happening in the way that we'd expect. Could you set out, what do we know about assisted dying as proposed in Westminster right now?
So the bill that's come forward it appears to have been cobbled together from different jurisdictions, and what it is to amend the Suicide Act to allow you to have a doctor's assistance in ending your life if you're terminally ill. It is a massive change to the healthcare system in our country and what doctors do, and there are a lot of unanswered questions. It will, for example, as we found out this week, require potentially the Foundational Act for the National Health Service to be amended so that the Secretary of State and the government no longer have a duty to maintain or improve the health of the public. You would have to go into that very first section of the bill, of the Act of Parliament, and change it, because now you are actually bringing to the end somebody's life, yes, at their request, but it is a huge deal, and we're doing it by private members' bill.
So I just want to make sure that I got that correctly, because that seems like such an astounding idea. I know we have international listeners who, may not have caught this. If I heard that correctly, you're saying that in order to pass this bill, Parliament would have to go back to the act that set up the National Health Service, the NHS in this country, and amend it to say, actually, you no longer have a duty to protect life or to foster the health and well-being citizens. Did I get that right?
Yes and no. It's actually, Parliament won't have to do that to pass the bill. It's concealed. There's a clause which says, Secretary of State, here you have all the power you need to set this up on the NHS. And it doesn't say, and it's what we call a Henry VIII power. What that means, if you think about it, Henry VIII, big guy, did what he wanted. It means a minister has the power to do anything that they want to already passed acts of Parliament where they need to. And so in this case, we heard this week from the person that wrote the bill that when they were asked by the Hansard Society, a very neutral organisation, what is that power that you've got in the bill there for? Would it mean you would have to amend the National Health Service Act? For example, because this, what they called the duty to protect life, is in that act, would you have to amend it? And the drafter said, well, the great thing is that, you're not limited by what's already in statute, and a power allows you to do it. So if you did need to change that, you could. I think that's something really that MPs have to confront, that power is in the bill. It's kind of concealed from MPs how seismic the change is to our National Health Service.
Wow, and unchecked as well. That is remarkable. I wonder, and could you speak a little bit to what is a private member's bill? How does this differ from the way that the government typically passes statutes, and then also kind of what do we have? Where are we in the process, and what do we have ahead?
Let me take you behind the scenes. What happens when a minister is legislating? So the government says, yes, we want to do something in this space. And the civil service will then go, okay, tell us a little bit more. What are your aims? What are you trying to avoid to do? And they'll take a brief. The civil service will then break it down and say, okay, right, this bit is about, for example, what will the role of doctors be? This bit is about judicial safeguards. This bit is about mental health. What do we need to think about that? And they'll break it down. What do pharmacists need to do? They'll look at what drugs might be involved. All the complexity will be broken down. Then the civil service will go away and talk to the experts. So they'll go and talk to the Royal Medical Colleges, they'll go and talk to the GPs, etc. They'll talk to the judges, the judiciary, and they'll come back to the minister and say, Minister, here's a submission on this particular element of the bill. These are your options. This is what we found out. These are the consequences. And then the minister will say yes, or there might be a lot of back and forth. And they'll work gradually through the bill in terms of the ideas before they put pen to paper. So it's a long process. There's consultation built in. You bring the public with you. It could take 2 years, but usually about a year would be about right. And that means that when the bill is actually introduced to Parliament, there's been a lot of tire kicking, there's been a lot of effort to establish consensus, and the experts have been in the room, usually, for its drafting. In this case, we have a private member's bill, which we find out has been written in just 4 weeks. It is written ostensibly by the bill sponsor, but open question as to who was also involved. And for example, this week we heard that one of the witnesses said, I've been quite close to the construction of the judicial clauses. So we don't know who really wrote this. And then the bill is just put into front of Parliament. So that none of that evidence taking, none of that consultation, none of that working out, is this the best option for our country, has happened. And it's put to MPs and they go, yes, they voted at second reading to say, we want this to proceed. Many MPs voted to say, actually, we want to look at the detail of this more. It's sort of a provisional yes. But that's the situation. So on one hand, a very extensive policy process. And I'm going on here. But when the bill is put in front of MPs for a government bill, you have an impact assessment. There's a human rights assessment saying which vulnerable groups might be affected. How has that been taken into account in the policy development? It would have what we call a delegated powers memo. So for example, that NHS power, it would say, what are we thinking of using this power for? Why do we think it's appropriate that we've taken this power? All those things would be in front of MPs. In this case, none of the policy making, none of the rationale has been presented, and MPs are just looking at the text of the bill. And for a private member's bill, usually they don't have much scrutiny in committee. Because of the uproar, they are taking evidence, which has never happened before. That required MPs to push for it, and a motion in the House. And they're now taking evidence, but two things. Sorry, we're just going to just take people down. There's so much. How do you give the full sense of the inadequacies of the process? So we have a committee. So with a private member's bill, the sponsor, the person who wants the bill to happen, chooses all the members of the committee. They choose all the witnesses that come and give oral evidence. And because they have a majority, they will choose which amendments are passed. So this is it's not a fact-finding forum, it's not a neutral forum, it's designed to support the bill onto the statute books. And that's where we are right now. We're in this committee stage, but looking at line by line scrutiny, but in a situation which is not designed towards truth finding or really testing, but maybe a bit performative.
It seems like this is a huge change to society. And in addition to that huge change, which is being run in this private members' bills process, which doesn't have the scrutiny you would expect, Kim Ledbetter, who's been given this, she said that she was approached by lots of charities after she got the first pick of private members' bill to put forward, and she chose this issue, not a long-standing campaigner as far as anyone knows on this issue. But she seems now to be in a huge hurry to get this through. And what is your sense? Is this being rushed as well?
Yes, it's being rushed. It has to be. The private members' bill process makes it a rush. Essentially, to pass the bill, there's a ticking clock for private members' bills. This is just so much in the reads, but there are 13 sitting Fridays set aside for consideration of private members' bills. This particular one needs to emerge from committee stage by really April 25th. If it is to get to the Lords and come back and make it onto the statute books before the session ends. Essentially, so let's try and take that a step back. The bill must make it to the statute books before the session ends. That means that there is constant pressure to keep the bill moving. If this was a government bill, you could go slower, because the government has control of the timetable, could provide whatever time is needed. You're not limited to those 13 sitting Fridays for this kind of stuff. If it was a government bill, you can do what we call a carryover motion. So you could go into the next session. You could take your time. It's an entirely artificially manufactured pressure to go quickly, on top of the desire by the individuals to not necessarily let this be live for too long. I do sense that the committee and those that are pro-bill don't want this out in the wild for too long, because they can see that the more it's out there, the more people are saying, hang on, have you thought about? And you're realising they haven't thought about it.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people are saying now, and something I think I've found myself saying. I've not been a long-standing interest in assisted dying and how to implement it, but is that it's easy to support it in principle, but it's the question of in practice now. That was the vote in the second reading in Parliament, was MPs, lots of them said it was, I support this in principle, and now it's time to get into the detail. From what you're saying, it sounds like the detail is not being given in anything like the scale you'd need for a bill of this magnitude, and it's being rushed in this, as you say, completely artificial setup where it's being really pushed through in what private members' bills are? They things like, I don't know, traffic regulations, or is it things that might be very important to people like me who are interested in things like that, but they aren't things that, as you say, unpick the whole of society. Gosh.
Can I also ask, will probably be a naive question, but why? Why is it being done as a private member? And I know you probably can't ascribe intent to anyone else, but you've worked in Westminster and in Whitehall. Why? Why do you think that it's being pushed through this way?
So we know that the Prime Minister made a pledge to Esther Rantzen, a high-profile campaigner on this, and said, I'll produce a vote. And I think, very sadly, that people thought, do you know what? The easiest way to do this without having to really own it is to make it a private members' bill. That, or just taking a step back. We've got over 50% of this Parliament brand new MPs. I think that applies also for the Labour Party, and there's a lot of pressure on the new MPs to be helpful. And it's quite possible that Kim thought, you know what, I can be really helpful to the Prime Minister and I'll bring forward this bill, without somebody in number 10 saying, if we want to do this, if we really believe as a government that this is the change we want to have as our legacy, then actually let's slow down. Let's make it a second, there's the parliamentary term of 5 years is chunked into sessions. Let's make this a second session bill. Let's take our time. There's a way to have it. You would have a strategy and say, we want to do this. It's really important. We view this as important a change as any major societal reform. Let's get it right. So I think there's a little bit of, who knows how it was thought of, but somebody certainly didn't take a step back and say, is this the right way to legislate, given what the public may think about us doing it in this particular way?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I look at Kim, Kim seems like exactly whether you agree with her politics or not, she's exactly the kind of person we want in Parliament. She's not a natural politician. She didn't want to be in politics, and she was a PE teacher, so she has life outside Parliament. And I feel like she's relatively new to Parliament herself, and for an issue of this magnitude to be given to her, apparently with a rush on, and obviously if it goes wrong, it will have awful consequences, like far beyond anything else that could go wrong, and her name will be associated with it forever. It will be the Kim Ledbetter bill, and I think that's really unfair to the kind of women that we want to have in politics, that she will potentially have this awful legacy if it goes wrong. And that's why I don't understand. If it was me, I can understand getting lots of pressure to do it fast, to do it quickly, to do it efficiently. But I think I'd want to say, do you know what? If this goes wrong, I will be associated with this forever. And I want to make sure it never goes wrong and slow down. But she doesn't seem to be doing that. Do you get an insight into what might be?
I think she's in it now, and I do think that there is a duty of care here. If this is something that she's been asked to do, then there is a duty of care to say, actually, we might have made it wrong. There are some ways to take this forward. We can slow down a bit. We can take it out of the PM. There are things that can be done there. I actually think that the 24 MPs on the committee are in a likewise position, because they are there to lend their names, to lend their reputation to the scrutiny of this bill, and they will be said to have done the job. So there's huge pressure on them to do that, and that is a huge burden when, let's just recap, you have 24 non-expert MPs. I think a couple of them are doctors. One might be a barrister, but 24 non-experts. I think well over half are brand new to Parliament with no experience of parliamentary scrutiny, potentially not a lot of political scar tissue to make you robust enough to have the big fights. And you need sometimes a little bit of the old guard to be doing that. They have no civil service that they can call upon. The government's not given them an impact assessment. There is no legal expertise they can call upon. There is nothing other than voluntary advice from other people. How does a committee do justice by this subject, and by Parliament and by the public?
Yeah, and I'm sensing that even having been there and given oral evidence and then interacted with MPs outside of that, I sense there's a real will and a commitment to try to do it right. But I do sense help me understand what's going on here, and I have to say, even myself, it took me probably a year to really wrap my head around the evidence, the international evidence on assisted dying, and all of the different questions that you should be asking. I didn't even know the questions to ask. And that brings me, I think we've kind of spoken really high level, and while we have you, which is a real gift to us, I wondered if we could ask you a bit more kind of in the weeds questions about this bill itself. And we have seen troubling cases abroad where these laws have been used and applied in ways that the policymakers, the members of the committee would have never anticipated. Young women with anorexia, we've heard harrowing stories here on this podcast from Canada. Do you think the bill itself contains sufficient reporting requirements that would allow, if things do go wrong, the public, medics to identify violations after they happen?
No.
Could you speak? No. Okay. Yeah. Straight up no.
And
you say why?
Yes, and again, I never expected to spend so long trawling through other systems, acts of parliament, and looking at the detail. I'm just going to quote for you. We heard, as you know, I think from 8 or 9 witnesses from overseas, all absolute advocates for assisted dying, and the ones from Australia in particular were saying there's absolutely no sign of a problem, etc. And we had them from Southern Australia and Victoria. So I went and looked at their legislation, and there isn't a requirement to report on if there's a issue. There are no whistleblowing provisions in this bill. So if somebody says, I'm not sure that I like what I'm seeing about how the doctors in my GP practice are doing this, there's no whistleblowing provision. There is no red flag provision in the bill. So when it says that a doctor refuses to sign off on the patient's request, the only thing the bill says is this is how you find another doctor to sign it off. Yeah. It doesn't say what you should do with the fact that a doctor said this shouldn't be signed off. There's no reporting mechanism or challenge or anything like that. And that's really a concern, because you would want to have an ability to raise the red flag there and there and say there's a problem here. The Attorney General for Victoria, and I'm just going to quote, I've got it here, he said, it's a system designed for the regulator to find out nothing, investigate nothing, and report nothing that could suggest that assisted dying has been anything other than an unblemished success.
Yeah.
And then for us to build our system on that, and to ourselves not build in that auditing mechanism, is incredible. And so you're again, it's something to be bear in mind. All this legislation is relatively new. The evidence base is relatively new. A lot of this has been passed in the last 5 years. So again, you are having people say that the absence of evidence, which is deliberately not being gathered, is evidence of absence of a problem. And that's a real sleight of hand. But when you go and look at Oregon, there you start to see some evidence of issues, not on coercion, not on those kind of things, but you are seeing evidence of complications at death. So there's lots of areas where you want to shine light, but the bill doesn't do that, and it's a real problem.
I'm so glad you flagged this. And I'll also say Oregon, the law it's been legal there since 1999, whereas in Australia, the Victoria Bill was passed in 2019, and most of the other ones were 2023. But I'm glad you flagged this, because I'm from the US, and we're in a situation where I'm communicating with the agency itself that's in charge of reporting and creating the annual reports, and they are acknowledging that anorexia nervosa has been listed as a qualifying terminal condition. They're acknowledging that it's not in the public reports because it's contained under these broad categories like other illnesses, or I've just learned nutritional and metabolic disorders. And then when I ask, is there any mechanism within the agency for investigating or reporting a potential violation of law, for instance, anorexia nervosa inaccurately being represented as a terminal condition, they say there are no powers vested within the agency. So you have this situation where the agency is the only, really outside of the doctor and the patient's family, they're the only ones that know that these cases have occurred because you can't see it in the reports, and they have no power to investigate. That I found shocking. And I'm glad to hear you say this, because I don't see anything in this bill that would address that issue.
I think it's really interesting what you said. It shouldn't have come down to you to have to go and ask this. And I was horrified by the blasé nature. One of the other witnesses said, it's only a couple of young women, as if we should just say, although it did spell out that for some it is a on the scales of saying, in order for me to have this autonomy, I am happy to accept the weight of accepting these deaths that shouldn't happen, that somebody will end their life because of this. So there is an honesty maybe to that. But I was struck by it. There's been a very interesting article in the British Medical Journal by Margaret McCartney, who's a doctor, and she says, look, as doctors, we wouldn't do what the committee is doing. We would have, I think she's independently authored, systemic review of what we know, what we don't know, what needs to be, what the gaps are. You would have a system of fact checking, not left down to journos or citizens and journalists and academics to try and find where somebody's asserted something and it's not the truth. You wouldn't be voting on something this substantial without real knowledge. And if the civil service had done this bill, sorry to bang this drum, but you would be having this paper in front of the MPs which would say, this is what we know and this is the gaps in our knowledge. And MPs would be armed to know what they are signing off on. And that's not happening.
It's really scary. I was really struck as well that the scale of England and Wales is perhaps 10 times greater than any of these places that we talk about, like Oregon, the Australian states. We are perhaps 10 times bigger. So anything that goes wrong, let's assume it's 10 times bigger when it goes wrong. And also that there are ways that it could go wrong that we'll see that we wouldn't see elsewhere. And evidence from the other half was to look at the scale of things like domestic abuse checks. So that's built into some of the Australian rules. Apparently it seems to detect nobody, or almost nobody, but that means that you could have in England and Wales potentially 1,400 domestic abuse victims being given an assisted death each year within the first few years of operation, because we would expect, like the Australian model, a very large number of our deaths, a very large proportion of our deaths, and we have a fairly significant proportion of them as over 60s, and maybe 15% of them suffer domestic abuse, and so you have actually a very large number of people who would be giving in an assisted death, and we haven't even thought about the moral or practical consequences of that. Or, it's 15 times greater than the homicides of domestic abuse victims and suicides of domestic abuse victims that we really worry about. And as far as I know, we're the only people who've raised that, so we've raised it in our written evidence, which was released in a big dump for the 600-odd MPs this week. And I suppose I wanted to maybe ask you about that approach that's been taken. So many organisations and individuals have sent in evidence, but it hasn't been published until, I'm not sure when we'll get this out, but this week. And MPs don't have long to make amendments. So if you're an MP not on the committee, you don't have the chance to make amendments beyond, perhaps Nikki, if you could explain what's next.
When you have a public bill committee, which is what this is, only the MPs in the committee can push to a vote and debate and speak on an amendment. But any member of Parliament can table an amendment. So all members of Parliament can actually play a role in this and say, actually, I'm going to push on this because it's really important to me. The committee will sit for the first time for line-by-line scrutiny on next Tuesday, and when the amendments for that have to be tabled on Thursday by 3 p.m. or the rise of the House. So MPs that are not on the committee were given 110 pieces of written evidence sometime Monday lunchtime. We were causing a fuss about the fact that they hadn't been published. And they've got to look through that and think, okay, what am I seeing? How do I pull together those threads? And what does that mean? Then how do I solve that into something that can be written down? Then I need to dash over to the Public Bill Office and ask the clerks, could you write this for me as a way that can be put in the bill? And then they table it. Now you could say, you can table as the bill goes. The problem is you don't know how fast the committee is going to go through the bill. So you run a risk that once they get past a stage in the bill, you cannot go back. So even if you spot a real big problem with clause 1, there's no way to go back once it's passed. So there's a real emphasis on getting your amendments tabled now, particularly for the first half of the bill. And look, I am working my way through that 110 pieces. And I just want to, if I may, I have gone through half of them, and I have 15 issues that were not even raised in oral evidence. There are some very deep issues that we know about. The issue of, is it just enough to have capacity? What about the mental state that we are in? We've talked about the risk of coercion. We've talked about vulnerability. All of those things. I'm not discarding them. I just want to add these additional ones, which still seem pretty serious to me. I'm going to just give you a highlight of them. So, no whistleblowing mechanism. Can hospices, care homes, or GP practices opt out as a whole? Are they able to say, we don't want to do this as an organisation? How much assistance can doctors provide before going into euthanasia? So the bill allows for assistance, but it doesn't say where the limit of that assistance is. It says it is silent on what happens if there are complications, and some very moving testimony from doctors saying there can be very severe complications. What happens if the patient is in distress after ingesting the substance and says, I've made a mistake? What is the doctor who's meant to stay there meant to do? What are they legally obliged to do? Should they be intervening? Do they need to stick with the patient's wishes as on the form? What happens? There's no oversight or accountability, as we've talked about. It also allows you to initiate at the moment, the bill allows the initiation of a conversation by the doctor to say, have you thought about assisted dying? And you can imagine that if you've just, as we heard from witnesses, if you've just heard that the prognosis for, that you have 6 months, to have that added to a conversation right there, it's a very difficult thing. But they can initiate that conversation with under 18s. I couldn't believe it when I read that piece of evidence, but I went back and checked the bill, and if I may, it's true. While the assistance to die is for over 18s, you can have that initial discussion. Doctor-initiated discussion with under 18s. The bill is quite clear on that. I'm not a doctor, but I think there is a whole different ballgame when you're talking about suicide-assisted death for young people, for young adults. There's a sensitivity there. So those are just some of the issues, and I'm only halfway through. How are the MPs that are not on the committee or in the committee meant to work out how on earth do we deal with that particular provision? And again, they have no access to expert advice to say, how should we deal with this?
I think that for many people, it's so shocking, the idea that someone could be given an assisted death under 18. But actually, we've seen that in multiple countries around the world, where it's actually become legal In the Netherlands, for instance, 12 and over can have an assisted death. And I think it's up till 16, you have to have parental consent, and then 16 to 18, you don't even have to ask your parents. So it's that international evidence that often doesn't get spoken about. I want to dig in because it was something that I had hoped to bring up in my evidence and just didn't have time. But this week, the Hansard Society called the drugs used in assisted dying a matter of considerable public and political interest and without any requirement for a parliamentary debate or vote. My experience is from the US, and in the US, the lethal drug protocols that are used have never been approved by any drug regulatory agency like the Food and Drug Administration or the DEA. They were developed using a kind of guerrilla style research without oversight from an institutional review board or an ethical body, because you can't get those studies. And we're talking human subjects research. We're talking, trying out a combination of some of the researchers call it blue whale-sized doses of morphine and other medications. And one, hoping it works, and two, hoping the complications aren't too bad. That's how we've developed the protocols in the US, and they're still used. And as you mentioned, the complications are significant, 10 to 15%. So my question is about the bill in the UK. Section 20, I feel like I know it's later in the bill, we haven't heard much section, but I noticed that the term that's used is approved substances and drugs. And my understanding is that is not terminology that's used in much of the regulatory legislation here. That's usually medicinal products. For a layperson, what does that mean?
I was thinking, where's this going? Am I equipped? And I'm going to give you an answer. I don't know, but I know I don't know. And the fact that the MPs are having to address this question in committee where they know nothing about drug licensing. Well, there's two GPs in the room. Are they going to talk about whether this is the right approach? I think it's really important because what this is being sold as publicly, the messaging is the idea of an easy death. And when the substance that might be allowed, be said, okay, you can use this substance, when it doesn't produce that death, when it is a prolonged death or there are complications or the individual is in distress, it will be down to whatever Parliament signed off. And you see it across the bill. Wherever there is an issue which is really hard to confront, it's left to a power. So MPs, don't worry about that. You don't have to put any guardrails. So that, and even if you change this power to what we call an affirmative SI, such that there's a vote, do need to raise your awareness that one of these statutory instruments hasn't been rejected for close to half a century. And MPs will only be entitled to a 90-minute debate. This is a really big issue. What is the drugs regime? I understand that in Oregon, and again, why am I having to go and look at all this? But I understand from the Professor Mark Talbot, he's done a thread on this where he said in the witness statements, the written evidence, they're saying that it comes through. Assisted dying is experimental. This was, I think the pharmacists were saying this, but I may be wrong. They were saying it's experimental, so the drug combinations are experimental.
That's right.
I think you'd want to know that if you are a patient wanting to access the provisions in this bill. Again, the bill doesn't require you to be told of the risk of complications. It doesn't require you to be shared with what might result. So if you are, again, this is a point made in quite a lot of the written evidence, if you are to take a fully informed decision, do you not need to know this information? So there's a lot of complications around the drugs, but I know I don't know. And I really ask the MPs to think about what are they really equipped to answer questions on, and do they feel that they can do justice by this?
Really is such a big responsibility for MPs, and as like you said, that they're inexperienced in Parliament, under huge pressure, huge public scrutiny, lots of pressure from campaigners, lots of pressure from interested parties. And I mean, just watching the committee actually, and particularly like when Chelsea was brought in, she raised the issue of women with anorexia being given assisted death, and then a series of additional witnesses were there invited to comment on this, and they said things like, well, that could never happen, and that doesn't happen at all, that's actually not allowed to happen, that would never happen. And I really appreciated Dr. Naomi Richards at the end, who said, yes, that happens, but it's only one or two. It's only one or two. And this, yeah, and yes, it's a distraction from a new mode of dying. But I think that is the challenge for MPs as well, is that they have to assume that the people who are giving them information have done good research, and so lots of the campaigners will provide, somebody who's for assisted dying will provide statements that say actually this works really well. We heard from a South Australian doctor who helps euthanise her patients that there's really no issue with complications, and Danny Kruger, in his Danny Kruger way, said, how do you know if you're not collecting evidence? And so there's this kind of complete absence of the normal types of feedback that you would get to tell you that something was going wrong.
I think the committee itself has been chosen very carefully, and it is distressing for me. I've got a whole wider issue about how we do scrutiny of legislation, but it's notable to me that those in favour of the bill are working very much together. They are clearly a team. They are coordinated, but those that have concerns are very disparate. You can't see any natural threads between them. A lot of them are quite new to Parliament. So the ability of them to push back in a cohesive way and say, as a bloc, we've got concerns, that's not there.
We have many MPs who made a vote at second reading and said, okay, in principle, I'll give this more time. I'm wondering what might be going through the minds of MPs who may be going, oh, this doesn't sound quite as good as I thought it did, but I've got a lot of constituents who have said I've voted. What might be going through their minds, and is there space even to go, maybe not this bill, or to tap the brakes and go, we need to revisit this at another time?
It takes strength. It is, to say, but you can say it because you are at the start of the Parliament. There is so much time left. We do not have an election for another 4 and a bit years. There is time to get this right, to build the consensus, to look at the detail, because this is being a conscience vote. It's not a party matter. MPs have been able to vote with their conscience. So they will also need to bear responsibility for this particular statute being on the statute books. This is their law. And so I would hope that they will consider this. And I want, Fiona, you mentioned about, they have to sift between what they're being told. One of the things that some of the MPs believe is that they get a vote on the final bill once it's been through the House of Lords. They do not. Once it leaves the Commons, the only further decision they have is whether they accept the individual amendments that the House of Lords makes. If the Lords makes no changes, the bill becomes law.
I did not know that.
So quite unlike with a government bill, where the Lords will often do a lot of the heavy lifting, for a private member's bill, the only house that really can do the heavy lifting is the House of Commons. And there's a whole bunch of complications, which I'm not going to burden people with. But the Commons has to do this. And the only amending stage which can really do the detailed work is this committee stage. And it's being made to do something it has never done before as a private member's bill, because the alternative is maybe just 5 hours on the floor of the House where all the MPs get to look at the detail. So this committee has to get it right. So my hope is that they do, and they take seriously their duty, because this is not just something to say, job done, we've changed the law. And while I may, if I can, we keep on saying, people saying, oh, there's no such thing as a slippery slope. And then they bring to us the witnesses from Victoria, and they bring to us the witnesses from California, and they will ask the question, what changes have you made since you passed your law? And the doctors say, oh, well, we actually had a problem. We didn't have enough doctors to do this, so we removed one of the doctors from the process, and that's been really good. Or they said, we thought actually that period of reflection on the decision to end your life, you don't need that, so we shortened it. And you hear again from the Victorian, the Australian doctors, they're saying, yeah, we think that period of reflection, it's an unnecessary impediment. You hear them saying this is how we would widen it. So the slippery slope comes from the passing of the act is a major step in changing how we approach this. And after that, people will propose successively, as we see. They'll use the reviews to say, oh, you should do this change, you should do this change. Once it happens, it happens. So to really think about where you're going with a policy.
And those changes seem minor, but the eliminating that waiting period is what in the US opened up the use of voluntary stopping of eating and drinking as a terminal criteria. So because you didn't have to wait a month, if you stop eating and drinking and thus your death is foreseeable in the near future, you are then, and we've seen cases reported, and we've seen academics essentially give a roadmap for how to circumvent the terminal illness criteria. And it was the elimination of that reflection period that did that. And you've also seen doctors being substituted for physicians' assistants and nursing associates in the US. So, I mean, it's almost, if a bill has been in existence in a country for 5 years or more, show me a country where it hasn't been loosened and amended. 5 years or more, and it'll happen.
That's what the Australian doctors said, that the boards who operate these systems in Australia said that safeguards, we start to see them as barriers. And you can see that each of those individual organisations, each time someone is denied VAD, voluntary assisted dying in Australia, they view that as a problem and something to be removed. And I thought that was quite important, because I know Janice Turner, who's the fantastic Times journalist, she spoke to the head of Dignity in Dying, big campaign group for assisted dying here, and Sarah Wooten proposed that if they win this bill, essentially they would collapse their operations and stop campaigning. So no slippery slope, which sounds wonderful. But what we see in Australia is that you don't need to campaign anymore. And because these organisations who are given the sort of oversight responsibility for assisted dying become the campaigners. They start to view it as something that must be offered to everyone, and any denial of assisted dying to somebody because of a safeguard is a problem to be solved. And I think that was quite staggering.
The law itself becomes a problem to be solved. Like, the actual statute on the books becomes, how do we get around the words on the page?
If I may, one of the reasons I wanted to look at this, I stood in the 24 election. And I was so surprised at how much email traffic I had on this issue. And I thought, one second, my job for the last 2 decades has revolved around Westminster. I never knew this was really an issue in Westminster. And I thought, this is very odd. And then we had this bill. But it was really I thought, why are people writing? I'll respond, but I'm not sure this is a thing. So I went and looked at Dignity in Dying's annual report. And I looked at the last 10 years' report, and they have detailed in meticulous detail their campaigning activities, not just here, but in Scotland, Republic of Ireland, Isle of Man, Jersey. And they talk about how they've pushed things on each time. So often we get people saying, oh, this has been a debate for 10 years in our country. Yes, because of one organisation, largely well-funded. They're spending about 1.6 million every year on this particular campaign. So I do question that assertion from them to say that they'll stop campaigning, maybe in this jurisdiction briefly, but they have a plan for lots of jurisdictions. So, and I don't want to, it's not to accuse, this is their mission. That's their entitlement, and actually hats off to them for being very honest in what they are doing. But there is a degree to which MPs are being surrounded by noise generated by a single organisation to convince them of the case. And, if you go and look at the More in Common polling, yes, there's an overarching headline figure of support with the public. But they also say they don't trust Parliament to do it. It's their least preferred way for Parliament to legislate. They say they would like more public consultation before parliamentarians legislate. So there's a picking and choosing here. So I've digressed, but beware the heavy focus of a single lobby group.
And I wanted to actually talk to you briefly about Scotland, because there is another law being proposed in Scotland where I believe 16-year-olds could be given assisted death, and there is no 6-month terminal illness diagnosis. It can just be someone whose death is likely to be brought about by their illness. And I know you had a Women Equalities brief for Time, Nikki, and I thought you'd be interested in what you said at the beginning, the impact on different groups. It should be part of what you do in any kind of bill. And so Liam MacArthur, who's the MSP who's pushing this forward in Scotland, has an equalities impact as part of his promotion of assisted dying. And he looks at the impact on women, and he quotes Dignity in Dying's paper in Scotland, which said that research has shown that the lack of choice at the end of life disproportionately affects women because they continue to be the primary carers at the end of life. And that's it from an equalities impact perspective. And I found that so striking, that you have this very one-sided view that actually it's good because women are carers, and if we remove the person they're caring for, I don't follow the argument. But Dignity in Dying, commendably, have been incredibly effective campaigners at the very centre of Westminster for such a long time. And they have shaped lots of the language that we think about things like mercy killings. Lots of the language we use when we talk about those has come from their campaigns. And as you say, I credit them for having been so diligent and committed. But the problem is they are campaigners. And having been a campaigner, I know that you are focused on achieving what you want, and you won't necessarily engage with the issues that people bring up. And I just think, gosh, if I was an MP, I'd want all the rock-throwing people who can chuck issues at this, who can start to flesh this out. If you were an MP, Nikki, if you had got your seat in the election, what would you be thinking as you go into this? Would you be thinking, I'm going to vote this down, even though it's going to upset lots of my constituents, even though I know it's a big deal?
Yes. Yeah. And the reason for that is, As Director of Legislative Affairs for about 4 years in Parliament, I bear the weight of legislation that shouldn't be on the statute books. And I was there during some of the pandemic. I came back, I was on maternity leave. I came back just before the second lockdown. And I saw firsthand the callous way in which we legislated on very difficult matters. I and a few other women fought a rearguard action to keep the playgrounds open, knowing how many people didn't have access for their children to any outdoor space. And we were seeing reports about domestic abuse during the lockdowns. And there were a few of us saying, it doesn't matter what you're worried. I know you're worried about transmission from surfaces, but there's a bigger picture here and you've got to keep the playgrounds open. We still legislated as a parliament, and I bear that weight. And so I say to the MPs that are in there now, this is your decision. The quality of this legislation is your decision. Please think carefully, because nobody but the 650 of you can do anything about this bill.
It's Fiona. Chelsea and I were so keen that we start to hear some really detailed debate on what assisted dying could look like here in the UK for women. We do not have big money funding, so if you'd like to support us, you can go over to our Substack and subscribe there, or you can donate to the other half on our website, theotherhalf.uk/donate. I'm grateful for this and so grateful for you listening. Thank you.